freedom, responsibility, and the battle of ideas. We live in a time when words are more powerful than weapons. They can heal, they can inspire, and they can build bridges between people. But they can also divide, mislead, and destroy reputations. That is why questions about speech, gender, equality, and power are no longer just academic curiosities, they cut to the very foundation of how we live together as human beings. There is a tendency in society today to claim that we are overly feminized, overly patriarchal, overly oppressive, overly liberated. Every side selects words to describe the world in a way that serves its ideology. But to truly understand the challenges of our age, we have to go deeper. We have to look beyond slogans and accusations, beyond headlines and soundbites, and ask, what is the purpose of all of this? What does it mean to live responsibly in a free society? How do we balance freedom with respect, equality with competence, identity with reality? These are not easy questions. They are not solved by political correctness, nor by simplistic appeals to tradition. They are solved by serious thought, honest speech, and above all, by individuals willing to shoulder responsibility for their own lives. Freedom of speech, the right to risk offense. At the heart of all these debates lies freedom of speech. Should your right to speak freely outweigh someone else's right not to feel offended? This is a fundamental question, and the answer defines whether a society remains free or slips into authoritarianism. To think at all, you must risk offense. Imagine a genuine conversation between two people who disagree. Both sides must push, prod, and challenge the other's beliefs. In doing so, they will inevitably create discomfort. But that discomfort is the price of truth. Without it, we become a society where no one dares speak honestly, where difficult issues remain buried, and where lies fester beneath the surface. When I speak about controversial topics, I am often told that my words offend. But notice something, those who accuse me of offense are themselves willing to risk offending me in the act of accusation. They are using their freedom of speech to challenge me. And that is as it should be. Dialogue requires courage. It requires mutual willingness to accept discomfort in the pursuit of clarity. A society that prioritizes not being offended over freedom of thought is a society that will quickly lose both freedom and thought. For once we begin compelling speech, once we tell people not only what they cannot say but what they must say, we enter dangerous territory. History is replete with examples of authoritarian regimes that began with forced language. And those regimes never ended well. Equality and representation, more than numbers. One of the recurring ideas in our culture is that true equality requires equal representation in every field. If half the population is female, then half of parliament, half of CEOs, half of professors must also be female. This seems fair on the surface. But fairness is not achieved simply by enforcing symmetry. Take bricklaying. 99% of bricklayers are men. Should we impose quotas to make half of them women? Clearly not. Few advocate for that kind of representation in dangerous, physically demanding jobs. Instead, attention is selectively placed on prestigious positions, boardrooms, political offices, and elite careers. This reveals something important. When people talk about equality of representation, they often mean equality at the top, not across the board. But if inequality is truly the problem, why stop at politics and CEOs? Why not ensure equal representation among sanitation workers, oil rig laborers, or combat soldiers? The truth is that differences in representation are not always signs of oppression. They often reflect different interests, temperaments, and choices between men and women. Studies show that in countries with the greatest gender equality, such as in Scandinavia, occupational differences actually increase. Women freely choose careers that are more people-oriented, while men lean toward things-oriented work. To interpret every numerical disparity as evidence of systemic oppression is to ignore both biology and choice. Equality must mean equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. We must ensure that doors are open to everyone, but we should not dictate who must walk through which door. The myth of the patriarchy. Another powerful phrase in modern discourse is the patriarchy. It is often described as a system of male dominance, an invisible structure that oppresses women at every level. But when we examine the evidence, the picture is far more complicated. Yes, men hold much of the world's wealth. But they also dominate the statistics for homelessness, imprisonment, suicide, violent crime, and battlefield deaths. For every man sitting comfortably at the top of society, there are many more struggling at the bottom. If society were truly designed for male dominance, why would so many men be crushed by it? It is easy to take a small substratum of hyper-successful men and use them as evidence of a patriarchal order. But that ignores the millions of men who suffer disproportionately in almost every negative metric. Men die younger. Men take riskier jobs. Men fall behind in education. Men commit suicide at far higher rates. Where is the privilege in that? Now, this is not to say that women do not suffer injustices. They do, especially in areas such as sexual violence. But suffering is not unique to women. It is part of the human condition. And the belief that all suffering is the result of a male-dominated conspiracy is not only false. It is dangerous. It divides society into oppressors and victims and prevents us from recognizing that both men and women struggle in different ways. Responsibility, the path to meaning. So what do we tell young people who look at the world and see climate catastrophe, economic instability, and a precarious job market? What advice is meaningful beyond simple slogans like, "Clean your room"? The answer is responsibility. Not responsibility in the abstract, but personal responsibility. Begin by addressing your own flaws. Put your own house in order before you attempt to reorganize the world. This does not mean ignoring social action. It means recognizing that real change begins with the individual. A person who cannot manage their own life is not prepared to manage society. But a person who cultivates discipline, competence, and resilience can expand their influence outward, first to their family, then to their community, and finally to the broader society. Our grandparents lived through wars, depressions, and unimaginable hardships. Do we truly believe our challenges are greater? The difference is that many of them assumed responsibility as a given. Today, responsibility is often treated as a burden to be avoided. But responsibility is not a burden. It is the path to purpose. It gives life meaning. And without meaning, all the freedoms in the world will feel empty. Misrepresentation and the media. One of the most frustrating aspects of public debate is the constant misrepresentation of ideas. A single phrase, pulled out of context, can become the centerpiece of an article, twisted into something unrecognizable. I have spent decades lecturing, teaching, and writing. Almost all of it is publicly recorded. Yet journalists often prefer to repeat the same handful of accusations rather than engage with the substance of my work. It is easier to attack a caricature than to grapple with complex ideas. Of course, I do not always express myself perfectly. No one does. But the endless repetition of shallow epithets, without evidence, without nuance, has created an environment where serious discussion is nearly impossible. We must demand better, not only from the media but from ourselves. We must resist the temptation to caricature those we disagree with. Toxic masculinity, a dangerous phrase. Another phrase that has gained popularity is toxic masculinity. It is said that this term does not mean masculinity itself is toxic, only certain harmful behaviors. But in practice, the phrase creates confusion. Masculinity is not toxic. Strength, assertiveness, ambition, and competitiveness, these are not poisons. They are virtues when properly directed. What is toxic is the corruption of these virtues into domination, cruelty, or violence. But to label masculinity itself as suspect is to tell young men that the core of their identity is dangerous. And here lies the irony. If masculinity is toxic, then what happens when women adopt traditionally masculine roles? Does the toxicity disappear? Of course not. What we call toxic masculinity is simply the shadow side of human nature, found in both men and women. Power corrupts, regardless of gender. If we continue telling young men that their instincts are dangerous, we will not make them better. We will make them resentful. And resentful young men are far more dangerous than masculine ones. Labels and misguided associations. Some accuse me of being aligned with extremist movements. They point to alt-right groups who have quoted me or cheered when I embarrassed a journalist. But think carefully, when 10 million people watch an interview, and most side with me, are we to assume they are all extremists? That is absurd. The reality is that ideas can be selectively adopted by anyone. My focus has always been on individual responsibility, truth, and meaning. If extremists attempt to twist that for their own purposes, that is their choice, not mine. To conflate popularity among fringe groups with endorsement is intellectual laziness. Identity and reality: what is a woman? Finally, there is the question of gender identity. What does it mean to say a trans woman is a real woman? I prefer to speak plainly. Biological women generally have XX chromosomes, female reproductive systems, and the capacity for childbirth. These are objective markers of sex. That does not mean that individuals who identify differently should be treated with cruelty or disrespect. Compassion is essential. But compassion cannot override reality. Men and women are alike in many ways. They are similar in intelligence, leadership potential, and personality. But small statistical differences between the sexes, in aggression, in interest, in temperament, lead to large differences at the extremes. That is why nearly all of the most violent criminals are men, and nearly all of the bricklayers are men, while women dominate in fields requiring empathy and communication. We must respect individual dignity without denying biological truths. To do otherwise is to sow confusion, not clarity. Conclusion: truth, responsibility, and freedom. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a simple but demanding truth: freedom is inseparable from responsibility. Speech must remain free, even if it offends. Equality must be of opportunity, not outcome. Suffering is shared by both men and women, and blaming one gender for the world's ills is neither just nor accurate. Responsibility begins with the individual, not with ideological crusades. We must resist the temptation to reduce the world to slogans like patriarchy, toxic masculinity, or oppression. These words simplify reality in ways that blind us to complexity. Instead, we must cultivate clarity, courage, and responsibility. The world is hard. Life is suffering. But meaning can be found. And it is found not by demanding that others change, but by first changing ourselves. When we put our own house in order, when we take responsibility. The world is hard. Life is suffering. But meaning can be found. And it is found not by demanding that others change, but by first changing ourselves. When we put our own house in order, when we take responsibility for our own lives, then and only then are we capable of building a society that is just, free, and humane. That is the task of our time. That is the purpose. And it begins with each of us, today.